Hello and welcome. My name is Tanya Day. On behalf of the Orange County Historical Museum board and staff, I welcome you to this recording with Tom Magnuson. Tom is presenting the fourth and final part of his series, The Networks of Early North Carolina History. This is called The Lasting Impacts of Carolina's First Settlers. With his first presentation of his series, Tom introduced the idea that the first contacts between indigenous peoples and Europeans in this area happened much earlier than originally thought, with peaceful and nuanced social cooperation between the two groups and frequent trading with privateers and pirates alike. He further expanded on trading practices and settlement in this area during his second program, noting that many early settlers were Cromwellian dissenters relocating to the Albemarle region in 1650, eventually developing into the first group of Quakers and controlling the area until Carey's Rebellion. The last time he spoke, Tom connected cultural settlement patterns with established road systems, noting that the military road known as Big Penn's Trace, built during Queen Anne's War, produced an escape route for those with different ideals out into the backcountry. Now, Tom will examine the implications and repercussions of these events, review his previously touched upon topics, and put together the puzzle of how these individuals and groups have created lasting impacts on the landscape, development, and cultural connections of North Carolina. Tom's insights are a result of 30 years of study of the earliest commercial transportation networks in the southeast of North America, in connection with the Trading Path Association, which he founded. The Trading Path Association is a nonprofit organization committed to finding and protecting remnants of the contact era in the Southeast. Through his work, he hopes to undermine the class-crippled view that has dominated the understanding of North Carolina's foundation story. Before taking us down these historical paths, Tom has had quite the journey himself. Born and raised in Minnesota, he spent time as a merchant mariner and later joined the U.S. Marine Corps. He earned a bachelor's and master's in American history while employed as a research specialist in the integrated circuit industry. He moved to North Carolina in 1978 to study under Theodore Ropp, the military historian at Duke University. And with that, Tom, I would be delighted for you to take us down this road once more, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. And thank you all for listening to this presentation. It's been a long time coming, and I expect that there's less excitement in this particular presentation than the others, because mainly what I plan to do is tell you what I don't know. And the axiom that the more you learn, the less you know is absolutely true. I have gotten to the point where I know a great deal about very little. And the difference, between a pro and an amateur is a pro knows what they don't know. So I'm going to tell you what I don't know and suggest ways that future historians may be able to uncover the evidence that will prove positive, confirm the hypotheses I produced in the first three presentations. In the first presentation, I suggested that the indigenous people of the Southeast were not unsophisticated. They were very commercial people and had extensive trade networks and a lot of contracting methodologies. We'll come across one of them in the presentation, probably. I believe from very sketchy evidence, but it's very suggestive evidence that the Native peoples in the Southeast provided food and water and to explorers and pirates and privateers in the Sounds. And one of the main reasons for that is that the Sounds, North Carolina Sounds, or the Carolina Sounds, are much closer to the Spanish Main than is any other secure port that a vessel could replenish in. Further, we have map evidence that we'll talk about later on. The main reason for all these presentations was a discovery that Moseley's map of 1733, which gets little notice among map historians, is in fact singularly important for it shows the earliest highway across the Piedmont, and it shows a well on Oak Creek teach Blackbeard practically lived in the Sounds and certainly died in the Sounds is further proof. Okay, so questions begging for answers. Whoops, there we go. These three presentations, like I said, the indigenous traders were resupplying explorers. In the second presentation, I talked about the first permanent settlement in Carolina. It was as with most founding peoples in North America, or in the English North America, they were religious refugees. The governor of Maryland and the governor of Virginia were both royalists to the bone, and during this Civil War, they sided with the king over the Parliament. And unfortunately, at the end of every war, there's a glut of labor on the market, and so a number of Cromwell's soldiers came to America thinking they'd be treated the same here as they were in England, and they were very wrong. In the case of Maryland, the Catholic proprietors saw them as heretics and was executing them. In the case of Virginia, he saw them, the Governor Berkeley saw them as traitors and harassed them at every opportunity. And they hid behind the Dismal Swamp on the north shore of Albemarle Sound, and they were armed and dangerous, so they were left alone. They moved in with their Native American neighbors, and they got into the trade with privateers and pirates, and had a very successful 50 years running the Sounds, literally. The third presentation was about their exodus when the Anglicans took over in the Albemarle Sound between 1705 and 1715. They left. I think a significant percentage of them left and went into the backcountry to shelter away from the Anglicans, who were, again, abusing them. And so I talked about that move into the backcountry, how they did it, using that road that shows up on Mosley's map. It's called Thigpen's Road or Thigpen's Trace. And I explained where they went and where their little pods of peace were located. And the most telling evidence of this, besides certain map information, is that the Occaneechi-Saponi oral history has them being sheltered by their Quaker friends from the Tuscarora War until the 1820s, when it no longer was feasible for Quakers to hang out in North Carolina. And they left with their Quaker friends, went up to Indiana and Ohio. This all got started when a couple of very respected North Carolina historians wrote a book complaining that North Carolina history did not have a foundation story. And I knew there was a good one, and that it was probably the most romantic of all of the colonies. So I'm here putting my 2 bits worth in. The supporting evidence for all the presentations is pretty well listed here. The Mosley map is the most important piece because it shows the route into the backcountry that was built between 1702 and 1704 and was available to the Quakers from 1705 on. And they took their flight down that road and didn't live near the road. They did not want to be seen. They were certainly fugitives. And so they lived about a half day to a full day's walk away from Thigpen's Trace. We have a number of journalists that came through in the 17th and 18th century to write about the backcountry. John Lawson's book, A New Voyage to Carolina, it gives us the most information we have about the backcountry at the time of contact. He was good enough to record a number of Native American words and locations and a lot of critters and plants. He was pretty much of a naturalist. And the reason he was making this trip is a very romantic story. His parents gave him money to travel to Rome for the Diamond Jubilee in 1700. And in 1700, he went to Plymouth and met some folks from Virginia who said it'd be more fun to come to America. And they offered him a contract to write basically a real estate prospectus after looking at the land that the proprietors owned. And so that proprietors sponsored his trip through North Carolina and South Carolina. And we benefited from it because his books are invaluable. In William Byrd's case, he wrote a history of the dividing line, and in that, which was done in the dividing line between North Carolina and Virginia, was done in 1820 or 1726, and he was part of that crew that did it. And he rode down to the New Hope Bottoms, south of Irwin Road in Durham, and visited Eno Will in his 2 villages on either side of a pretty little rivulet, according to Byrd. There's a historical marker. I now know that there are 3 historical markers in Georgia commemorating Thigpen's Road. And I'll locate the last 2 and get them out on the internet as soon as possible. There's also a genealogy of the Thigpen tribe, which James Thigpen was one of the founders of the Thigpen tribe. His family were in trouble for being dissenters in Yorkshire before the Civil War, and I believe he was one of the dissenters in Perquimans County. That's where he had his ford and his inn, and he was a member of the militia. Got a contract to build a road in 1702 from the mouth of the Appomattox River in Chesapeake Bay down to the Gulf of Mexico. He completed the road in 1704. And in 1704 and 1705, Colonel Moore led a militia army down there and beat up on the French in Mobile Bay, and then went over and destroyed the Indian allies of the Spanish. The Quaker Creek meeting has an interesting history, which I believe indicates that they were one of the hidden settlements of Quakers in the back country. They didn't get their meeting established until the 1750s, when Quakers came in from Pennsylvania with some conflicting doctrines. And they felt the need to get a meeting going to preserve their doctrines. The main differences between the Albemarle Quakers, who became Quakers after they were visited by George Fox, the founder of the Friends Society, they became Quakers after 1672. And they literally produced their own version of Quakerism. And the 3 distinct differences between the Albemarle Quakers and the Pennsylvania and London Quakers was, one, the biggest one, the Albemarle Quakers actively encouraged women ministers, which were forbidden in both the London and Philadelphia meeting. And also, I'm reasonably certain that the Albemarle Quakers never gave up their weapons or their right to self-defense. They weren't pacifists. But the third thing was that they stayed away from government as much as they possibly could, unlike the Pennsylvania Quakers. So finally, we have a book called Powells Gazette. There are 2 editions, a yellow one and a blue one, I believe. Yes, and you should have a copy of them. You can find them in any used bookstore, or you can go to University of North Carolina Press and get one of each. And it's good to get one of each because the yellow was the first edition, and it contains all the most colorful place names. In the 1970s, North Carolina created a commission to neutralize the place names in the state, get rid of the N-word, but also they got rid of some stuff that was pretty neat. There was a stream that was renamed Cold Bottom Stream because a hunter walked down that stream in the middle of fall and just about froze, and he named it for the coldest part of his body. The Gazetteer shows 4 different places that have Quaker place names, and there are no other places in the Gazetteer that have specific religious names. You can find things like Methodist Pond, but you can't find Methodist Mountain or Methodist Gap. The Quakers were in there so early that their place names were on the land before the land was mapped, generally speaking. So the important thing about this talk tonight is that we need to find source material on all 3 of those subjects. The Quakers of the Albemarle, the Native American traders, commercial activities of Native Americans, and the process of saving North Carolina's Native American populations from slavers after the Tuscarora War. The South Carolina Army that came up to fight against the Tuscarora was paid with all the slaves that they could capture, and they didn't pay much attention to what tribe you were with. So we think that the Quakers had to have been in the backcountry by the end of the Tuscarora War to prevent the tribes of the Piedmont being wiped out. So all 3 of those subjects need work. Well, here we have John. Wait a minute. I may have to have another page up here. No, that's it. This is John Lawson's map from 1709. I put it up just to show you just how naked it was. There are no towns identified specifically. There are a handful of Native American names, but no discernible village sites that you could call cities. And in spite of the fact that on the north shore of Albemarle Sound, there were roads galore by 1700. Right? The settlers had been there from 1650 on, and they had a real matrix of roads between Albemarle Sound and Virginia and throughout the Albemarle district. The only other roads, and we're going to look at another map right now. This is to show you the good detail that I think Lawson created for the shorelines, but the absence of any indication of occupation tells me that he intentionally made his map look as though the land was just dying to have settlers move in on it. This is the 1733 Moseley map I've been talking about all along. And you can see up here, this is the Albemarle district, and those are all wagon roads. And this is a wagon road cutting across the Piedmont. And the other wagon road went from Edenton down to Charleston, or Charlestown at that time. And it was probably pioneered around 1672, I think, or a little bit later perhaps, to connect. Charleston came into being in the 90s. There was a failed attempt at a colony on the Cape Fear before that, but the proprietors wanted to connect the southernmost port in their colonies with the northernmost port in their colonies. So they had a road running from Edenton down to Charleston. And this is what I consider to be the most important map in North Carolina history. You'll see a few more details here. When I say it was a wagon road, I thought it was just a footpath or maybe a pack horse trail until I zoomed in. And when I zoomed in, I found the 18th century convention for a wagon road with two parallel tracks colored between them. And that shows what the ground looked like when a wagon rolled over it. So we're talking about a wagon road built between 1702 and 1704. Now, there's one version of the Moseley map has a number of inserts, 3 or 4 inserts, inset maps. And these two that I'm showing here demonstrate that, in fact, Moseley was the author of the map, because both of these maps reflect developments that were made after Lawson's demise. But here's the one I like the most. This inset map shows Ocracoke, and it shows a well, a large well, right on the north shore of Ocracoke Island, near something called Thatch's Hole. Well, of course, Thatch was Teach, was Blackbeard. So the thing that is important to me about this is that Native Americans didn't dig wells. They did not have the technology for well digging, especially in sand, which is highly specialized, and it requires the ability to make planks, pit saws and that sort of thing. And the way you make a well in sand is you make a box. Somebody climbs inside and cleans the sand out from under the box, and you hammer it down and you put another box on top of it. And you continue that until you get to the water table. And the Ocracoke well got bricked. It was bricked up, we believe, at the time that the coastal defense forts were built in the 1820s and 30s. I want to get down there one of these days and get a photograph of the bricks inside that well and see how they compare with the old forts down there. This is the Thigpen Trail marker in Georgia. There is absolutely no evidence of who, we know who made it, but he left no notes, he left no files. So we don't know what he was looking at when he wrote this up. But it testifies to the fact that Thigpen's Trail ran through Georgia. Now, the way Thigpen Trails work is it's within a few miles of Highway 85 all the way down south of Charlotte, at which point it gets on the Broad River south of Charlotte. It crosses into Georgia and makes its way to the west until it reaches a ridge that runs all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it was all built on top of Native American paths that had been turned into pack horse roads. And this is the self-published book that has James Thigpen's genealogy in it. So we know he was real. They mentioned the fact that he built the road in that genealogy as well. Why has North Carolina turned a blind eye on this history? The reason I mentioned earlier that I took this project in hand was that their estimation of the people in the Albemarle I thought was off-putting. The off-scouring of Virginia and Maryland infuriated me, because these when George Fox arrived and visited them, in his journals he said, these are the most godly people. They're doing this the right way. They're living with their Native American neighbors. And that probably was their undoing. And here's a parallel story of what happens to someone that offends the successors. That should be Robert Carter, not Robert. Robert Carter manumitted over 500 slaves in the 1790s. Took him 10 years to do it, as he was training every one of them to have a trade once they were freed. And in reward for this, his house was burned down 3 times, and he has been written out of Virginia history, period, because he embarrassed George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, all of whom held on to their slaves, in spite of the stirring words of the Declaration of Independence. I think something similar happened in Carolina. First of all, the indigenous folk did not conform to the stereotype that the Anglicans wanted to foist on them, basically that they were simple and crude and unrefined and worth killing. The Quakers, the people of the Albemarle had demonstrated there was no need to kill indigenous folks if you respected them. More importantly, they interbred with their Native American neighbors. And of course, the one drop rule proved their undoing, I think. And it was carried forward into the 20th century with Jim Crow. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the successors to the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, and Archdiocese for North Carolina made a formal apology for supporting one drop and slavery and segregation for those hundreds of years. Let's see if I can find another picture for you. Oh, this is Carter at the time that he was first recognized, a young man, and at the time that he freed his slaves. So that was probably painted around 1800, the one on the right. What's the evidence we need, and where do I think we might find it? Ship trade in the Sounds will require archaeological and anthropological study. I don't know how many digs have been performed in the quarry lands on the Sounds. I know that there's a site on the New Hope Bottoms where there is a village that was one of Will's villages. And I believe that the New Hope Bottoms, which is what they call a corn bottom, is a plain that floods regularly, so it gets refreshed soil. And the Native Americans love this for their farming. And between Irwin Road in Durham and the Haw River to the south is a 13-mile long, half-mile wide corn bottom, suitable for commercial farming. And I believe that that's what happened. Will, as it happens, was a Corey Indian, and he married a high-status Occaneechi Saponi woman and got control of these villages by that means. And that was a very common way of sealing a business contract amongst the Native Americans, was marriage. That way the parties learned one another's language, one another's culture, and were able to cooperate most effectively. We also need to, if we have a chance that somebody needs to look at the privateer and explorer and pirate logbooks and the Reuters, and look at those logs for visits to the Sounds. There's a growing literature on pirates that's just been exploding over the last couple of years on pirates on the periphery of England's new empire. And I think someone should develop a comprehensive bibliography of this literature. I've got one started, but I'm growing a little bit too old to finish it up. You can scour court records in New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina for evidence of illegal trade along the mid-Atlantic seaboard or legal trade. Piracy was not what we think of as right now. Piracy provided most of the European goods that the proprietors couldn't provide to Carolina. And as an example of the ambivalence about piracy, Blackbeard's married his 14th wife, who was, we think, 14 at the time, down on the Sounds, and the governor and lieutenant governor of Carolina attended the wedding. Look for those court records on trade in the Sounds. And then we have records from Fort Henry, which was Abraham Wood's frontier fort. And Woods was sending traders all the way to the Mississippi and to the Gulf of Mexico in the 18th century and early 18th century. And he and Governor Berkeley I believe, wanted a piece of the action down in the Sounds. And a fellow named Nathaniel Batts was sent down by Woods, and I think he actually guided the dissenters into the Albemarle when he moved down there to horn in on the trade with the mariners in the Sounds. The evidence for the first permanent settlement in Carolina is it's actually been, there's a couple of good books about it. The most important one is by Hugo Prosper Lemming. He was a minister just off the campus at University of Chicago, late in life. He decided to do a PhD and tell the story of his people, the Albemarle people. And his church was a mixed racial church. And he wrote a tremendous dissertation. The footnotes are absolutely invaluable, but it was so poorly edited that it couldn't be read. I have read the 1966 version, which was his unedited dissertation. His church had it published by Vanity Press, but sufficient nagging of publishers resulted in Reuters, not Reuters, I can't remember the college now, a publisher hired an editor who cleaned up the text, and it was published in 1995. So if you're going to get John Lawson, the Lemming book, you can find it online and get the 1995 edition, because it really is wonderful. Everybody who has written papers or books about the Albemarle has used this book, and very few of them mention it in the footnotes. I'm appalled. And I think maybe Lawson sent his manuscript maps to his London publisher, so somebody needs to go through them. Movement into the back, Thigpen's Trace, I think the contract has to exist somewhere in the British colonial or military records, as somebody paid for the road, and it was a multi-colony effort. That is, the road started in Virginia and ended south of Carolina in what became Georgia. Somebody paid for that. So there has to be a record somewhere in Europe, in England, or in the British archives. And we need a map that shows the location of the Albemarle Quakers affiliated meetings in Carolina. The Cane Creek meeting fancies itself to be the mother of meetings, because of the great number of Quaker meetings they spawned from down there in Cane Creek. The earmark of their meetings is women ministers. And I think we can make a map of all the meetings that they claim to have created, and some that they don't even realize were spawned by the meetings that they had spawned, which was the method for getting a meeting. What you did is you sent someone to your previous meeting to get permission to open a meeting elsewhere. And in the case of Cane Creek, they sent two women down to Perquimans County, not up to Pennsylvania, down to Perquimans County to get permission to open their meeting. We need to find out how many of the pre-1745 Cane Creek meetings males ended up as regulators. We know some did. I've asked scholars for years to compare the list of the over-the-mountain men who came down to Kings Mountain and whipped up on the British, and see if the Quaker surnames appear in their number. Stephen B. Weeks made a map of Quaker meetings in North Carolina in 1896, and an overlay of that, rubber sheet of that on top of a current map, and then overlaid with Thigpen's Trace, could be very revealing. My eyes are too weak to work with GIS anymore, but I hope somebody has got enough interest to pull together these maps and compare and contrast. I'd like to see a Quaker names list Cane Creek meeting, like I said, and from the meetings it spawned. Also, I'd like to see a map of all the North Carolina meetings that have female ministers today. Well, one effect of the Albemarle Quakers is that to this day, North Carolina has the highest incidence of female Quaker preachers in any state. Yeah, another interesting phenomenon that we can, I think, attribute to the Albemarle Quakers is that North Carolina, if you included our triracial population, red, white, black folks, would have, if you included them as Native Americans, North Carolina would have the largest population of Native Americans east of the Mississippi. And that's thanks to that protective services provided by the early Quakers. Find these over the mountain participant lists, compare the land grant lists at every county, at the county level, for people with Quaker surnames, and then map it all. I'd love to see that database done. I can't do it myself, but hopefully somebody out there understands GIS and can pull that information together. The British records, there will have to be some serious granting to allow scholars to go to England and study the records there. The North Carolina Archives acquired a great many North Carolina records, but there's no mention in the archive of Thigpen or Thigpen's trace, and that's just wrong. Whether it was just information because it was from the Albemarle, I don't know. But if it was suppressed in North Carolina, it probably was not suppressed in England. Early maps of the counties, this is a personal thing. I think every county in the 100 counties in North Carolina has some I guess hermit studying the land grants of that county. In our case, the county land manager is assiduously building a map of all of North Carolina, of all of the county land grants and state land grants and colonial land grants in Orange County, or in the greater Orange County as well. I've tried to gather or create a meeting to get all these people in the same room at the same time, to create a centralized repository to standardize the map making so that everybody uses the same scale and so forth. I think it would be a very good product for blockchain. And I think Virginia and Maryland will have information in their archives pertinent to early North Carolina, as well as the archives in South Carolina. Virginia, Georgia, and North Carolina all have documents germane to Thigpen's trace, Queen Anne's War, and commerce in the Sound. Now, I hadn't mentioned Queen Anne's War before. It went from 1702 to 1715. I believe the War of the Spanish Succession in Europe. But that was the reason that the Carolinians marched on the French and the Spanish, was to push them back away from what became South Carolina, where the Appalachia allies were raiding almost up to Charleston. And so that was the purpose of the military campaign during Queen Anne's War, and that called for the road to be built. So the Moseley map produced all of those questions. And what we know about the Moseley map is, to some degree, we believe it's dependent on work of John Lawson, because he mapped the Sounds in great detail before the Tuscarora did him in. He also probably traveled Thigpen's trace in 1702 or 1703 while he was still the Surveyor General. And the map, his map of Carolina, the 1733 map of Carolina, shows Thigpen's trace ending at the forks of the Yadkin River. And that indicates it might have been mapped in 1703 before the road was finished down into Georgia. 2 out of 3 of the inset maps reflect Moseley's work after Lawson's death, but I think the Ocracoke Inlet map suggests Lawson's work. By Moseley's time, there were very few, if any, privateers or pirates replenishing in the sounds. Early in his career, right after the death of Lawson, there was still some action in the sounds, but that dried up very quickly when the British Navy got involved. The well by Thatcher's Hole probably predates Lawson's survey of the sounds. So that's as much as I know, and I'll take any questions that anyone has. You can reach me at my email, which is tmagnuson, TMAGNUSON @tradingpath.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for putting up with me.
Thank you so much, Tom. I am really excited about the potential that this has. I think that it could be a really neat research project. And as you said before, it is really short-sighted and narrow thinking to say that North Carolina and the Carolinas don't have an interesting foundation story, because it seems like they were so many moving parts and so many cultures and so many people coming together. And I hope that in the future, academics can come together and further flesh this out.
Thank you. That's my hope as well. And thank you for sponsoring these talks, and thank the board for me.
I sure will. Thank you so much. And could you say your email address one more time for anybody interested?
That's tmagnuson @tradingpath.org. TMAGNUSON, Magnuson, @tradingpath.org.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tom. And thank you to anybody who is watching this link. If you'd like to get in touch with the Orange County Historical Museum, you can find us at www.orangehistorync.org. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Now,